What's up, party people? This is Drumsynth on the MPC. In firmware update 2.9, Akai released an exciting new plugin called Drumsynth. This is a free update to the MPC-X, Live 2, Live 1, and MPC software. A key concept to understand about Drumsynth is that it uses synthesis to generate sounds instead of samples. Previously, if you wanted a drum sample in your MPC, you had to sample a drum sound into the device. And due to the nature of the sample, you couldn't alter it much. But with Drumsynth, sounds are modeled and processed within the plugin, and they are highly customizable. Let's take a close look at Drumsynth. We are in a blank project, and we switch the first track to a plugin, and in the program section, we select the type and scroll down to the MPC drum plugins. We can expand this to see several drum synths. Basically, there's a different synth engine for each type of sound, such as a kick, snare, hi-hat, etc. Let's select a kick and load it into the project. Now on the main screen, we can see our plugin is loaded, and we can select the preset field to switch between presets within this synth engine. The pads on the MPC now act like a chromatic keyboard, and we can play the kick at different pitches, and we can change these settings in the pad program menu. We can load several plugins on different tracks and build a beat from scratch without samples, which is pretty cool. How many instances can we load? Good question, and we'll talk about that more in a bit. So far, we've only seen the tip of the iceberg. Let's look under the hood of the Drumsynth plugin and see how we can create our own sounds. To access the Drumsynth menu, go to the Program Edit screen. On an MPC Live 2 or Live 1, press the Menu button and then press Program Edit. On an MPC 1, just press the Program Edit function button. Now in the screen, we see a beautiful interface in a variety of parameters, all of which can be changed to sculpt the sound to fit your taste. A concept to remember about Drumsynth is that each instance of the plugin is made up of a synth engine and a group of effects. The type of synth engine and its parameters vary by sound, but the effects are always the same. We'll explore each of these in detail. Here on the main Drumsynth sound page, we see the synth parameters that make up this sound. Below the sound graphic, we see the basic settings of this sound. Model is the type of drum sample being emulated. Glide time is the amount of time for a sound to transition from one pitch to another. This is also known as portamento. It's an important setting when creating bass lines and melodies. The one-shot setting toggles between the sound playing from start to finished when engaged, or playing the sound only as long as the note is held when disengaged. Chromatic toggles the pads to play chromatic notes when engaged. Otherwise, they will play the pitch set by the tune parameter when disengaged. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Velocity is the amplitude of the envelope. The pads are velocity sensitive, so you can decrease the velocity by simply playing softer on the pads. But this parameter allows you to set the maximum velocity at a specific level. And counterintuitive as it may seem, setting it to 0% is full level. Now we see velocity 2 and a corresponding target. We can set the target to one of the 8 parameters of the sound, shown in this column. Keep in mind that some sounds don't have all 8 parameters. For example, let's set it to the first parameter, which is tune. At 0% in the velocity field, nothing will happen, but we can set it plus or minus 100%. Now when we play a pad at different velocities, we can hear how this changes the sound. If we wanted to, we can turn off chromatic, and we can control the pitch of the sound via the velocity of a single pad. Next, we have the output gain of the sound at the synth level before it moves on to the effects. To the right, we see 8 parameters of the synth sound. These will be slightly different depending on the sound selected. Even changing the model will change these parameters. For that reason, we won't look at every single parameter of every sound. But you should know that these settings allow you to change the sound in ways that far surpass what you can do with an individual sample. Let's adjust some of these settings to show you some of what's possible. The tune setting is very useful. With this setting, you can select the root note of the sound. If you want your mix to sound right, you'll need to tune your kicks. Otherwise, they can be out of key and your mix can sound whack. With this setting, you don't have to guess what key your sample is in, and you can adjust it precisely. Okay, let's adjust some parameters and see what they do. Now we have a different sound. To the right of the 8 parameter section, we have the Effects Toggle section. Here we can engage and disengage the 4 effects that come bundled into each Drumsynth engine. We have a transient shaper, distortion, an EQ, and a compressor. A white box means the effect is engaged. Let's look closely at each of these. On the bottom of the screen, we can see 3 tabs. The first is the main sound page, and the effects are on the other 2. And it's important to note that this is also the signal path of each Drumsynth, from left to right. Selecting the second tab, we have the transient shaper and distortion. Having a transient shaper is a very useful effect to have. It has 3 parameters. Attack can be set to plus or minus 100%. Shape is the shape of the transient, and sustain is the sustain of the transient. The next area is the distortion effect. Before we start with this effect, there's 2 important things to know when you're working with effects. 1. The effect won't be applied until it's engaged on the effects toggle to the right. And 2, even after you've engaged it, you won't hear the affected sound until you've added it to the mix. In other words, the mix knob needs to be above 0% to be mixed with the original signal. We see a pre-shape setting, which is the amount of high-end tone of the incoming signal. The drive setting is where most of the distortion characteristic comes from, and you can boost the incoming signal by 60 dB. Threshold is the level at which the effect is applied. The lower the level, the more it is applied. High cut is a filter frequency cutoff from 20K to 1K. We also see an output gain on the right side before it passes on to the next page of effects. On the next tab, we have an EQ and a compressor. First, we'll need to toggle on these effects to engage them. The EQ consists of a 4-band EQ with a gain setting for each. The high band is a high shelf with a frequency from 1K to 20K. The gain setting is plus or minus 12 dB with a cut below minus 12 dB. We have a high mid band that adjusts between 120 Hz and 16 kHz. We also have a Q adjustment for this band and the low mid band. This adjusts the resonance or the bandwidth at a specified frequency. Q can be adjusted between 0.04 Hz and 10 Hz. And we have a gain adjustment of plus or minus 18 dB. There is a low mid band that adjusts between 40 Hz and 8 kHz. It has the same Q and gain adjustments as the high mid band. Then we have a low band, which is a low shelf with a frequency range between 20 Hz and 1 kHz. Gain can be adjusted between plus or minus 12 dB with a cut below minus 12 dB. Next we have the compressor settings. There are 4 settings total. Threshold adjusts the level at which the compressor is applied, so the lower the threshold, the more it is applied. Ratio is the amount of compression being applied at the threshold. A ratio of 1:1 means no compression is applied. This ratio setting can be set up to 100:1, which is basically a limiter, and it will flatten everything above the threshold. The attack setting adjusts how quickly the compressor will engage. You can adjust it from 100 microseconds to 300 milliseconds. And then you have the output setting, which adds makeup gain to the output of the compressor. A quick side note about compression. It is an important tool in controlling dynamics in your mix, and it can be a little intimidating to understand how it works. Comment below if you want to see a dedicated video on compression. Lastly, we have a final gain output for this page of effects. Now that we have an understanding of what settings and effects are used within Drumsynth, there's a few more things to show you. One of the most exciting features of the Drumsynth is what they called the Multiplug. Let's go back to the main page. Select a new track, select Plugin. In the Program section, select Plugin. Scroll down until you see Drumsynth Multi. Let's select it and load it into our project. You'll notice that the pads are different. We can see that there are 8 lit pads which form a kit of different sounds. What they've done is load 8 individual Drumsynth engines into a single plugin. This is super convenient. You can quickly sequence drums without having to switch tracks. We also have presets to swap the whole kit on the fly. Let's take a look under the hood and see how the parameters and settings work on the Multiplug. By selecting Program Edit, we see a similar beautiful interface as before. But at the bottom of the screen, we see the tabs are different. Each tab has a numbered drum synth, which corresponds to one of the 8 lit pads. And if we tap each tab, we can cycle through the effects pages that we saw previously. We also see a right arrow showing additional tabs. And unlike the individual Drumsynth plugin that we saw previously, we see that Multiplug has 2 additional tabs, Send Effects and Mixer. Selecting Send Effects shows us 3 additional effects that we don't get in the individual Drumsynth. In addition to the other 4 effects per sound, we get a delay, diffuser, and reverb, which are global to the Multiplug. In the delay settings, we get a time adjustment from 1/32 to 8/4 of a measure of the global tempo. There is a ratio setting to adjust the amount of delay on the left channel versus the right. You can create an offset pan if we wanted. Feedback is the amount of delay signal applied into the mix. We have a filter between 1K and 20K, and we can adjust the resonance of the feedback signal from 0 to 100%. We can also adjust the frequency of the resonance between 100 Hz and 10 kHz. In the diffuser section, we see a time delay setting between 1/64 and 4/4 of a measure. There's a feedback adjustment between 0 and 100%. There's a bright setting, which adjusts the high-end frequency of the diffuse signal between 0 and 100%. In the reverb section, we have different types of reverbs that can be selected in the mode field. The options are Hall, Stadium, Room, and Abstract. Time adjusts the tail of the reverb from 0.4 seconds to infinity. Low Cut applies a low-pass filter between a frequency of 1 Hz to 1 kHz. High Cut applies a high-pass filter from 1 kHz to 20 kHz. Again, on the right side, we see 3 toggle switches to engage each effect globally within the Multiplug. Let's look at the Mixer tab. By selecting it, we see the main mixer section and all 8 channels of the Multiplug. Here we can adjust the output level and pan of each sound. You can even select the name of each sound and change the sound type for that channel so you're not stuck with the sounds of a given preset. We also have solo buttons for each sound by pressing the S button on that sound's channel. We can also see that cue links are assigned to 2 channels at a time to adjust volume and pan. By pressing the cue link function button, we can cycle through all 8 channels. Pressing the mixer button again gets us to the second page where we get a matrix of toggle switches for the 4 effects within each of the 8 sounds. If we press the mixer tab again, we get a third page where we get effect send settings per sound for each of the 3 global effects. Here we can apply the effects to the sounds as much or as little as we want, which is awesome to have this much control. Alright, there's just a few more things worth knowing about Drumsynth. First, you can only have 1 instance of the Multiplug per project. You'll get a warning if you try to load more than 1. Second, you can only have 8 plugins per project. You will get a warning if you try to add more. Pro tip, you can have 7 plugins on dedicated tracks and then have the Multiplug on an 8th track for a total of 15 plugins. Boom! Another pro tip, you can sample Drumsynth to make your own kit. Now we have a program of samples that were made via the Drumsynth Multiplug, and we've freed up the Multiplug for additional use. Boom! Alright, the bottom line is that Drumsynth is impressive and adds value to the MPC platform. The stock presets are decent and far better than a lot of synthesized drums out there. The amount of control and flexibility you get is good, and many users will appreciate what you can create with Drumsynth, especially when you start creating sounds of your own. And finally, a few criticisms and areas of improvement. First, within the Multiplug specifically, it would be very convenient if the sound page followed the currently selected pad. Currently, you have to navigate the tabs, which is less than convenient. Second, it would be great to have visual feedback on some areas of Drumsynth, like when setting threshold levels on effects relative to the input signal. And on the mixer page, it would be nice to see meters per sound. It may be a big ask, but seeing a wave shape as well as an envelope of the sound would be nice. Lastly, it would be awesome to have the ability to load samples into at least 1, if not 2, of the sound channels of Drumsynth. Since the MPC Drumsynth appears to be based on Air Music Tech's Drumsynth 500 software, where 2 channels are reserved for user-loaded samples, it doesn't seem far-fetched to see this added to the MPC version. It would allow far more possibilities and expression in sound design. Lastly, on the sound page next to the one-shot toggle, it would be great to see a reverse switch to reverse playback of a sound. Alright, party's over, thanks for watching.